Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to this special five-part podcast series. I am thrilled today to have Sharlyn Lauby with me. Sharlyn, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
I'm looking forward to our conversation, and thanks to everyone for listening.
This podcast series is around culture. It's around Speak Up, the intersection of the two. And the reason I was so excited to visit with you is because we get to set the stage about what is a Speak Up culture. But before we get there, could you tell our audience about your professional background?
Sure. I'm a human resources professional. My background is in theme parks, hotels, and airlines. And my last corporate job was vice president of human resources for a global organizational consulting firm. I went out on my own over 15 years ago. And my focus as a human resources professional is primarily in organizational development activities. My clients range from large multinational organizations that I'm sure everybody has heard of, and small best places to work that I'm pretty confident a lot of people have not. So that's who I am.
So it strikes me you've been doing culture, you've been doing Speak Up long before it was called Speak Up and culture as well. So that was one of the reasons I was really thrilled to start this podcast series with you. Maybe we could set the stage. How would you frame the issue of what is a Speak Up culture?
When I think of the term speak up culture, I think of organizations that communicate well. And what I mean by that is that the organization can talk with employees about this is what's going on with us. I've worked for companies that were facing tough times and they went to employees and said, this is the challenge that we're faced with right now. And conversely, the employees feel that they can go to the organization and talk about, we think we can make this process better. We think that we could do X and it would be helpful to customers. So when we talk about a speak up culture, we're talking about a culture where both employees and the employer feel like they can communicate well. But that also means that employees feel a certain level of trust with the organization. They feel like they can say, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? Or I'm overwhelmed right now. Can you help me reprioritize my work? Or something is happening in the company and I don't think it's right. And I want the company to look into it. So when we're talking about speak up culture, not only are we talking about the negative, as in I have a concern, something's not going well, but we're talking about the positive in terms of this is what we can do to make the workplace better.
I often say that the key leadership trait is listening. It sounds like that's equally true for the corporation as well.
Absolutely. And this, you've worked with lots of organizations, but when we talk about communication skills, we spend a lot of time saying know your audience and communicate using the right medium, whether it's in person or in writing. But a big piece of that is listening. When employees come to you, when employees want to talk with you about what's happening in the organization, they want to know that the organization is going to listen. That's a big part of culture. People will come to you if they think that you'll pay attention to them.
The only academic study to look at Speak Up culture stunned the academician in his finding that there was a material lessening of fines and penalties in a company that not had a Speak Up, but did not have a hotline, but a true culture of Speak Up. But you said something else that I wanted to pick up on, which is it's not simply about I see a problem or reporting the negative. It's much more powerful when employees want to share their ideas with management. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit and why you find that to be such a powerful tool inside of a corporation?
I'll expand on it by telling a story. Years ago, I worked with an organization that was facing a challenge. They were going to be $1 million behind budget. And they went to employees and said, we want you to know this. We're $1 million off budget. And we're trying to think up ways to find $1 million. And they went to employees and said, if you help us find $1 million, we'll give you a percentage of the cut. And what they did is they said, here's two criteria. You either need to come up with an idea that will raise revenue or decrease expenses. And we'll put together a review board if you bring an idea, and the employee, it'll go through a review. And if we implement it, you will get a piece of the increase in revenue or the decrease in expense. The company made their $1 million. In fact, the company made $5 million. And it was a powerful lesson for the organization. One, they told employees what was going on in the company. And employees had an opportunity to bring ideas. They got vetted. It wasn't like everything got implemented. But when you listen, you can do great things. And a lot of organizations need to realize that employees on the front line have some fantastic ideas to make the organization better. The company just needs to listen.
I have to tell you, you've given me a line I'm going to use for the rest of my career. When you listen, you can do great things. That was fabulous. Let's move to other issues, other ways for companies to engender trust, because listening is one, but there also have to be policies and procedures and actual actions in place to protect employees who do have the courage to speak up. Could you say a few words about the need for what we call anti-retaliation, not just in theory, but in practice as well?
I think part of speak up culture is when an employee says, I have a concern or I don't feel that something is going right, and the organization makes a commitment to investigate things. If employees talk this, employees talk. And so if an employee feels that there's something not right, they want to know that there's some place that they can go and express their concerns. And if they feel that the organization will take their concerns seriously and that they will investigate concerns that need to be investigated, that all becomes a part of speak up culture. I think employees are willing to bring things to the attention of management if they feel that they will be properly dealt with. And that gets to your point about retaliation, that I'm a pretty easygoing person and I think of myself as being pretty reasonable, but I'm not going to accept in any way, shape, or form retaliation. And if people didn't know anything about me, they knew that about me. And the managers and the employees were really clear, hey, Sharlyn doesn't accept, period, end of discussion. And I do believe when you're talking about culture and things like that, make it really well known and stick to it.
Every company or every U.S. public company now has to have a hotline. There are people like yourself in HR, people like myself in compliance. We try to encourage people to speak to us if they need to or want to. But I find that it's largely middle managers. And even when I was an employee, I wanted to go in my boss's office and say, hey, I saw this, or this, I had this question, or my stomach didn't feel right when I was doing this contract because I was a lawyer. And that's the relationship most people have. How do you train middle managers to listen, to accept the information, report up to someone like yourself as appropriate, and then help the employee get through that process? That seems to me to be a big job for middle managers.
I think that there's one of the things that I thought was always important to me as a human resources professional was to build relationships with the managers, not to view me as I'm the no, you can't do that department. There were times when I had to say, no, you can't do that. But what I found is if I could try to build relationships with managers, they would come to me before we ever got to that point. I'm reminded, I've worked for companies, am reminded of a relationship I had with an employment attorney. And when I would call my employment attorney to say, this is going on in the company, he would ask me, he'd go, what do you want to do? And I would say, okay, this is what the company wants to do. He goes, you can do that. And so I was always reminded of that whenever I talk to managers. Don't come to me and put me in this no, you can't do. Tell me what you want to do and we'll figure it out. So a lot of times it's so important to just build that relationship so managers will come to you. And as part of Speak Up culture, that a manager will say to you, hey, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to handle this. Can you help me? And we figure it out. We figure it out together.
The Department of Justice has communicated that they have believe compliance should have a role in institutional justice and institutional fairness in a corporation. And I wanted to use that as a way to introduce the topic of how you handle investigations, consistency and transparency. Why is that important in an overall speak up culture?
Organizations need to have a process in place for investigating things. It needs to be known throughout the organization. There will be times when you will have lots of investigations going on, and there'll be times when you have none. So, depending upon your organization, you want everyone to know that if a concern is brought to the company, i.e., HR, or a manager, it will get investigated. And in some cases, with the manager, you might discuss this during your management development training, supervisory skills training. You might say, if you're brought a concern, bring that to HR and partner with HR to make sure that an investigation happens. And you can speak to it much better than I can, the risk and the liability to the organization if a concern is raised and the company ignores it. So, bringing those things to human resources, having a plan in place to investigate is an important part of speak up culture. Because employees will walk around and say, if you have a concern, bring it to HR because they'll take care of it. Or they'll come back and say, oh, the last time I raised something to HR, they didn't do anything about it. And that sets the stage for future communications. So, employees knowing that they can take concerns to human resources or their manager and they will be investigated is an important part of speak up culture.
I'm a big believer in something called the fair process doctrine, which generally says if people believe the process is fair, they'll accept a result that perhaps they didn't want or they weren't anticipating. Was that generally your experience when you were in the corporate world as well?
I agree. I always like to say proper processes yield good outcomes. So putting that process in place is important. And it, you mentioned the word fair. Employees feel like their concerns are being dealt with in a fair and consistent way. If I bring a concern to HR and it gets handled one way, and you bring a concern to HR and it gets handled a different way, that doesn't look fair. And so creating that environment where people feel like their concerns will be addressed consistently is important, and it's defensible. But more about that than I do, right?
Charlene, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or really the topics we've touched on today, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Probably the best place to connect with me is out on LinkedIn, and you can just look me up by name, and there I will be.
Charlene, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.